June 12, 2023. Location, Central City. The sun is like a molten ball in the cloudless desert sky, radiating unrelenting heat. On the cracked asphalt road leading into the city, the road seems endless, stretching through barren lands dotted with sparse, withered bushes. This city has no memorable name to outsiders, but to those who know about it, it is a notorious place where illegal laws, written words are sharper than anything. Which law? No one can enter without feeling its suffocating control and prejudice. Sophia Grant, a renowned billionaire and one of the most accomplished FBI agents in the country, navigates her SUV through a desolate desert town, notorious for its deep-seated prejudice. Opting for a casual appearance, she wears a white miniskirt and blouse, a stark contrast to her usual professional attire. Sophia is on her way to an important meeting, choosing this route to save time. The sun blazes overhead, intensifying the oppressive atmosphere of a place where hostility and discrimination linger in every corner. Sophia Grant approached the checkpoint marking the town's entrance, her SUV slowing as the sun beat down on the cracked asphalt. Two police officers leaned casually against their cruiser, exuding an air of smug authority. Their expressions were not those of polite professionals, but of men who thrived on intimidation. As Sophia came to a stop, one officer approached her window, tapping sharply on the glass with his knuckles. The sound was jarring, more a warning than a greeting. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his wide grin anything but friendly. His partner stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching silently with the same unsettling smirk. Sophia rolled down her window slightly and handed over her ID without a word. Her calm exterior belied the tension she felt. She had encountered officers like this before, men who enjoyed wielding their power over those they perceived as vulnerable. The officer examined her ID, his grin widening when he saw her title. "Huh, fancy," he remarked, handing it back with an exaggerated flourish. "What brings someone like you to our quiet little town?" His tone dripped with condescension. "Just passing through," Sophia replied curtly, her voice steady but firm. She kept her gaze locked on his, unwilling to show even the slightest hint of unease. "Well, enjoy your stay," he said, stepping back and motioning her forward. Yet his smile remained fixed, his eyes narrowing as she drove past. The interaction had been brief, but it left Sophia deeply unsettled. It wasn't just the officer's mocking tone or their invasive stares. It was the unspoken message behind their actions. She wasn't welcome here, and they wanted her to know it. As her SUV moved further into the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Pedestrians turned their heads to follow her car, their expressions eerily similar to the officers, smiling but devoid of warmth. Sophia gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitened. She was no stranger to scrutiny, but this felt different. It wasn't just hostility. It was as if the entire town shared a sinister secret, and she was the outsider they had already decided to target. As Sophia Grant drove further into the small, oppressive town, the weight of her unease grew heavier with every mile. The streets were nearly deserted, save for a few pedestrians who stared at her SUV with the same unsettling smiles she had encountered at the checkpoint. Their cold, mocking eyes followed her, making her feel like an intruder in a place where she clearly did not belong. Hours of driving through barren landscapes and empty roads had taken a toll on Sophia. Low on fuel and desperate for a break, she finally spotted a roadside cafe, the first sign of civilization in miles. The establishment was small and run down, its flickering neon open sign barely visible in the dimming light of the setting sun. With no other options, she pulled into the gravel parking lot, stepping out of her SUV as the dry desert air cooled around her. The cafe's door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the smell of stale coffee mixed with frying grease hit her instantly. Inside, a few patrons sat scattered at faded booths or on cracked stools at the counter. The moment Sophia stepped in, the room fell silent. Every head turned in unison, their gazes locking onto her. Those same unnerving smiles greeted her, sending a chill down her spine. Sophia forced herself to walk to the counter, her FBI training helping her maintain her composure, even as her instincts screamed at her to leave. The man behind the register, wearing a stained apron and a scowl, looked her up and down, before speaking. "What'll it be?" he asked flatly. "A coffee," Sophia replied, her voice firm, "and directions to the nearest gas station." The man's lip curled into a sneer. "We don't serve your kind here." Sophia's eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering across her face. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, leaning forward on the counter. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "This ain't a place for people like you. Get out." The laughter started then, low chuckles from the other patrons. Sophia turned to see them watching her, their eyes filled with malice. Her fingers tightened into fists at her sides as anger flared, but she kept her voice steady. "I just need gas," she said sharply. "I'll pay and be on my way." The cashier shook his head slowly, his smile widening. "Not happening. Get out, or I'm calling the cops." Sophia realized the futility of arguing. She was alone in a hostile place with no allies. Any further confrontation could escalate into something far worse. Taking a deep breath, she turned and left the cafe, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as mocking laughter erupted behind her. Outside, the air felt colder than before, pressing against her as if the entire town itself was rejecting her presence. She returned to her SUV, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. Her fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, but the gas pump attached to the cafe was no longer an option. She would have to keep driving and hope she could find another station before running out. The sun dipped below the horizon as Sophia drove into the growing darkness. The laughter from the cafe still echoed in her mind, mingling with the oppressive silence of the desert. Her SUV sputtered and slowed before the inevitable happened. The engine died completely, leaving her stranded on an endless stretch of road with no signs of help in sight. As she sat in the stillness, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Sophia had faced countless challenges in her career, but nothing had ever felt as isolating and dehumanizing as this. Sophia Grant sat in her SUV staring out into the endless desert as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Her vehicle had run out of gas, leaving her stranded on a remote road, far from any help. She dialed the local authorities, her professional instincts telling her it was her only option. The dispatcher's indifferent response didn't inspire confidence, but within minutes, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the encroaching darkness. A patrol car pulled up alongside her, its lights casting an eerie glow on the barren landscape. Two officers stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate. One was burly with a thick mustache and a towering frame, while the other was wiry, his sharp eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. Both wore wide, toothy grins that seemed more predatory than friendly. "Evening, ma'am," the burly officer said, tipping his hat as he approached. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble." Sophia rolled down her window just enough to be heard, keeping her expression neutral. "I ran out of fuel. Could you assist me?" "Well, that's what we're here for," he replied, his grin widening. "Why don't you step out of the car so we can take a closer look?" Her instinct screamed at her to refuse, to lock the doors and stay inside, but she knew the precariousness of her situation. Out here, miles from any backup or witnesses, refusal could escalate the encounter. Reluctantly, she opened the door and stepped out, the cool desert air brushing against her skin. Her white miniskirt fluttered slightly in the breeze, and she immediately noticed the officer's eyes tracking her every movement. The wiry officer let out a low whistle. "Well, ain't this our lucky night?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Looks like the FBI sends its finest." Sophia straightened, her voice firm. "I'd appreciate it if we could keep this professional." The burly officer chuckled, stepping closer. His shadow loomed over her as he leaned in. "Oh, we're always professional, ma'am. But you've got to understand we don't get many visitors like you out here. Makes for a memorable night." Sophia took a step back, trying to create distance, but the wiry officer moved to flank her, cutting off her retreat. Her heart pounded in her chest, the oppressive silence of the desert amplifying every word and movement. "Look, I just need fuel," she said, her voice sharper now. "Can you help me or not?" "Oh, we'll help you," the wiry one said, his grin unwavering. "But first, we've got to make sure everything's in order. Routine check, you know." Without warning, the burly officer reached out, his hand brushing against her shoulder and sliding down her arm. Sophia flinched, instinctively stepping away. Her voice was sharp and commanding. "That's enough." The two officers exchanged a glance, their smiles twisting into something darker. The wiry officer leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing murmur. "You got some attitude, don't you? Out here, that's not a good thing. People like you need to learn when to keep quiet." Sophia's jaw tightened, her anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she forced herself to remain calm. She was outnumbered and isolated, and any wrong move could turn the situation from bad to catastrophic. The burly officer reached for her again, this time letting his hand linger on her chest. Now, he said, his tone mockingly soothing. "Don't get all worked up. We're just doing our job." Sophia's reaction was immediate. She slapped his hand away, her eyes blazing. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The wiry officer's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. "You've got a mouth on you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's gonna get you into trouble." The burly officer stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You're a long way from home, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "Out here, no one's going to hear you scream." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her pulse pounding in her ears. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she weighed her options. She wanted to fight, to run, to do anything but stand there and endure their taunts, but she knew the risks. For what felt like hours, the officers continued their harassment. Their hands brushed against her as they circled her like predators, making crude comments about her appearance, her clothing, and her race. Each word and touch felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into her resolve. Finally, the burly officer stepped back, his grin returning. "All right," he said, his tone almost cheerful. "We'll fill your tank. Consider it a favor." Sophia didn't respond. She stood stiffly by her car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the ground as they worked. The wiry officer leaned close to her again, his voice barely above a whisper. You should be grateful, you know. We could have made this a lot worse for you." She didn't flinch. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. When they were done, the burly officer handed her a receipt with a flourish. "All set?" he said. "Drive safe now." Sophia climbed back into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She started the engine and drove away without looking back. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing, but the humiliation and fear lingered. She had never felt so powerless. Miles down the road, Sophia pulled over, unable to keep driving. Her body shook as sobs racked her, the isolation of the desert pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. For the first time in years, she felt small, exposed, and violated. Despite all her power and achievements, 2 corrupt men had stripped her of her dignity, leaving her shattered but alive. Sophia Grant pulled into her driveway hours after the incident, her hands still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The familiar sight of her home, usually a sanctuary, felt foreign and uninviting. As she turned off the engine, she sat in silence, trying to gather herself. But the events of the night replayed in her mind in excruciating detail. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. When she finally stepped out of the car and entered the house, she found her husband Marcus waiting. Marcus, a high-ranking FBI agent with a commanding presence, immediately noticed something was wrong. His sharp eyes scanned her face, taking in her tear-streaked cheeks, the redness in her eyes, and the way her hands shook. "Sophia," he said softly, stepping forward. "What happened?" She wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Her lips parted, but all she could manage was a small, shaky breath. Said, his voice steady but filled with worry. "Talk to me." As Sophia sank into the cushions, she began to recount the ordeal. At first her voice was quiet, halting, but as she described the encounter with the officers, their taunts, their invasive touches, and the humiliation she endured, her words became sharper, laced with anger and pain. Marcus listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every detail. By the time she finished, his face was a mask of fury. "They touched you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sophia nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield against the memory. "They did more than that," she whispered. "They stripped me of my dignity. They made me feel powerless." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, his nostrils flaring as he began pacing the room like a caged animal. "This is unacceptable," he said, his tone seething with restrained rage. "They think they can get away with this? Not on my watch." Without hesitation, Marcus sprang into action. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, his voice commanding and resolute as he reached out to his most trusted contacts within the FBI. As a senior agent with significant influence, Marcus had the authority to act swiftly, and he wasn't about to let bureaucracy slow him down. Within hours, Marcus had assembled a specialized task force. The team consisted of agents handpicked for their expertise, loyalty, and commitment to justice. Many of them had worked with Sophia before, and their respect for her was evident in the way they immediately responded to the call. When Marcus briefed them on the situation, his tone was firm but impassioned. "Our targets are Officers Hank Carter and Ray Smith," Marcus said, pulling up their profiles on a screen. "They've been stationed at the town's checkpoint for years, and based on what we've uncovered so far, they have a history of misconduct. Complaints against them have been buried, and they've operated with near total impunity. That ends now." The team worked through the night, combing through records and gathering evidence. As the investigation deepened, they uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond the two officers. The town's law enforcement was rife with racism, abuse of power, and a culture of silence that allowed bad actors to thrive unchecked. Marcus kept Sophia updated as the operation unfolded, but she struggled to find solace. Despite her gratitude for her swift action, the emotional toll of the incident weighed heavily on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and angry not just at the officers, but at the system that had allowed them to act with such impunity. A few days later, the task force was ready to move. Marcus and Sophia led the operation, both dressed in sharp black suits that radiated authority. The plan was precise and unrelenting. They would confront the officers at the same checkpoint where the harassment had occurred. As the convoy of FBI SUVs approached the checkpoint, officers Carter and Smith lounged by their patrol car, sipping coffee and exchanging crude jokes. Their laughter faded as the SUVs surrounded them, blocking every possible escape route. Agents poured out of the vehicles, their weapons holstered, but their presence undeniable. Sophia stepped out of the lead SUV, her gaze cold and unyielding. She had shed the vulnerability of that night, replacing it with the steely resolve of an FBI agent who refused to be silenced. Standing beside her, Marcus addressed the officers. "Officers Hank Carter and Ray Smith," he announced, his voice steady and commanding. "You are under arrest for harassment, assault, abuse of power, and misconduct. Step away from the vehicle and drop your weapons." Hank let out a sharp laugh, though it sounded forced. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "You think you can roll in here and start making accusations? We're cops. We're the law out here." "You're not above the law," Marcus replied coolly. "Not anymore." Ray, less confident than his partner, glanced nervously at the agents surrounding him. This is ridiculous," he stammered. "We didn't do anything wrong." When Hank made a sudden move toward his weapon, an agent tackled him to the ground with precision, disarming him in seconds. Ray froze, his hands in the air, as two agents approached him. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" he yelled, his bravado crumbling into panic. Both men were cuffed and hauled to their feet, their protests falling on deaf ears. As they were loaded into the back of a waiting SUV, Hank glared at Sophia, his face red with fury. "Do you think this changes anything?" he spat. "This is our town." Sophia didn't respond. She watched silently as the doors slammed shut, sealing their fate. For her, the arrests were only the beginning. The task force's investigation would continue, uncovering more corruption within the department and sparking nationwide outrage. The case became a rallying cry for justice, shining a spotlight on systemic racism and abuse of power. Back at home, Marcus tried to comfort Sophia, but she remained haunted by the events of that night. While she was proud of the progress they had made, the emotional scars lingered. "You did it," Marcus said one evening, his tone filled with quiet admiration. "You brought them to justice." Sophia looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Then why do I still feel like they won?" Her resolve had carried her through the ordeal, but the weight of what she endured remained, a reminder that even in victory, the fight for justice is never truly over. Sophia Grant sat quietly in the lead SUV of a convoy of FBI vehicles, her face a mask of determination. The air inside the car was heavy with anticipation as her husband Marcus reviewed the final details of the operation. After days of meticulous planning, they were about to bring justice to a town where corruption and prejudice had thrived unchecked for years. The operation targeted two specific individuals, Officers Hank Carter and Ray Smith. Both men had been stationed at the checkpoint on the outskirts of the town for years, acting as gatekeepers to a community steeped in systemic abuse. The investigation, led by Marcus and supported by Sophia's first-hand account, had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Complaints about Carter and Smith ranged from harassment and excessive force to overt racism. Despite multiple reports, no meaningful action had ever been taken against them. Their behavior had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and complicity within the local police department. Sophia's role in the operation was deeply personal. It was not just about professional accountability, but about reclaiming her sense of agency and standing against those who had stripped her of her dignity. As the convoy approached the checkpoint in the early morning light, the tension in the air was palpable. Hank Carter and Ray Smith were lounging by their patrol car, sipping coffee and laughing, oblivious to what was about to unfold. The peaceful desert morning was shattered by the sound of engines as the convoy surrounded the checkpoint in a precise formation, blocking every possible exit. The officers froze, their casual demeanor quickly replaced by confusion and unease. "What the hell is this?" Carter muttered, tossing his coffee cup to the ground as he straightened up. Smith's eyes darted nervously between the SUVs, his confidence visibly waning. The SUV doors opened in unison, and a team of FBI agents poured out, their movements swift and calculated. They wore tactical gear, their presence a stark contrast to the laid-back setting of the small-town checkpoint. Weapons remained holstered, but their authority was undeniable. Leading the team was Sophia, dressed in a sharp black suit, her expression unyielding. She stepped forward, with Marcus at her side, her heels clicking against the cracked asphalt. The two officers instinctively took a step back as she approached. Gone was the woman they had mocked and harassed days earlier. In her place stood an unshakable force, the full weight of the law behind her. "Officers Hank Carter and Ray Smith," Marcus announced, his voice firm and commanding. "You are under arrest for harassment, assault, abuse of power, and misconduct. Step away from the vehicle and place your hands where we can see them." Carter let out a bark of laughter, though it was tinged with disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "We're cops. You think you can just waltz in here and start making accusations? This is our town. We are the law." Sophia didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, but razor sharp. Not anymore. Smith glanced nervously at Carter, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "We haven't done anything wrong. You've got no evidence." "Oh, we have plenty of evidence," Marcus said coolly, "enough to make sure you never wear a badge again." Carter's bravado faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You think you can just come in here and take over? You don't know how things work in this town." As if to prove his point, Carter made a sudden move toward his holstered weapon. The FBI agents reacted instantly. One tackled him to the ground with precision, disarming him before he could even touch the gun. Carter struggled against the agent's grip, roaring in frustration. "Get off me," he bellowed, his face red with fury. Smith raised his hands in surrender, his voice trembling. Don't shoot, I'm not resisting." Two agents moved in, cuffing Smith without incident. His protests were drowned out by the sound of Carter's continued shouting as he was hauled to his feet. Both men were escorted to a waiting SUV, their protests falling on deaf ears. Before Carter was loaded into the vehicle, he turned to Sophia, his glare filled with venom. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "This is our town. You're an outsider. You don't belong here." Sophia met his gaze with icy calm. "Justice belongs everywhere," she replied, "and so do consequences." With the arrests complete, the focus shifted to the larger investigation. The FBI task force didn't just stop at Carter and Smith. Using the evidence gathered, they uncovered a network of corruption that ran deep within the town's law enforcement. Other officers, emboldened by years of unchecked power, had engaged in similar misconduct. Complaints of racial profiling, harassment, and excessive force had been systematically ignored or dismissed. The entire department operated under a culture of silence, protecting those who abused their authority. As the FBI's presence in the town grew, more individuals began to come forward. Victims who had once been too afraid to speak up now felt empowered by Sophia's actions and the arrests of Carter and Smith. Their testimonies painted a grim picture of a department that had long thrived on intimidation and prejudice. The investigation also revealed complicity among local officials. Records showed that misconduct complaints were deliberately buried, and whistleblowers within the department were silenced through threats or retaliation. The case quickly gained national attention, sparking outrage and calls for reform. For Sophia, the operation was a bittersweet victory. She had achieved what she set out to do: hold her perpetrators accountable and shine a light on the corruption that enabled their behavior. Yet, the emotional scars from her experience lingered. Despite her outward composure, the memories of that night haunted her. Back at the FBI field office, Marcus approached her after the final briefing. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You brought them to justice." Sophia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Justice doesn't undo the damage," she said softly. "It doesn't erase what they did." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, but it makes sure they can't hurt anyone else. You've made a difference." The impact of the operation was undeniable. The arrests of Carter and Smith marked the beginning of sweeping changes within the town's law enforcement. Corrupt officers were removed, policies were restructured, and oversight was strengthened. Activists and community leaders joined the effort, turning the town into a symbol of accountability and resilience. Yet for Sophia, the journey was far from over. The operation had been a step toward justice, but it couldn't erase the humiliation and violations she had endured. As she left the office that night, she resolved to channel her pain into further action. The fight for justice, she realized, was ongoing, and she would not rest until systemic change was achieved, not just in one town, but everywhere. The fallout from the arrests of officers Hank Carter and Ray Smith sent shockwaves across the nation. The case, initially focused on their blatant harassment of Sophia Grant, soon revealed a much darker reality. A deeply entrenched culture of systemic racism and corruption within the town's law enforcement. Investigations uncovered years of misconduct, including racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power, all shielded by a web of complicity that stretched into local government. The revelations ignited public outrage, drawing widespread media attention and sparking debates about policing and accountability. Communities across the country rallied behind Sophia's story, seeing it as a symbol of resilience and the urgent need for justice. Activists organized protests, demanding nationwide reforms to prevent similar abuses of power. Advocacy groups and legal organizations joined forces to push for policy changes aimed at increasing police transparency and accountability, not just in the town, but across the United States. In the town itself, the FBI's investigation spurred a complete overhaul of the police department. Corrupt officers were removed, and new leadership was brought in to rebuild trust with the community. Training programs emphasizing de-escalation and bias awareness were implemented, while oversight committees were established to ensure accountability. For marginalized communities within the town, these changes marked a turning point. The reforms empowered residents who had long suffered in silence, giving them a voice and hope for a safer, more equitable future. While the case exposed painful truths, it also became a catalyst for transformative change, proving that even in the face of injustice, progress is possible when the fight for equality is relentless. Although Sophia Grant successfully brought her harassers to justice and spearheaded significant reforms, the personal cost of her ordeal was profound. The humiliation, fear, and violation she experienced left emotional scars that no amount of professional success could erase. Every quiet moment brought back memories of that night, the taunts, the invasive touches, and the powerlessness she felt. Despite her strong exterior, Sophia struggled to reconcile the woman she had been before the incident with the one who now felt vulnerable and exposed. At home, her husband Marcus noticed the cracks in her composure. While he offered unwavering support, Sophia found it increasingly difficult to confide in him. She felt trapped by the weight of her emotions, unable to escape the lingering shadows of what she had endured. Seeking solitude, she left the house one morning before dawn, leaving behind only a brief note: "I need some time to clear my head. Don't worry." Sophia drove into the vast desert, hoping the endless horizon would bring her peace. Days later, her abandoned car was found near a trailhead, but there was no sign of her. Search teams combed the area tirelessly, but Sophia Grant had vanished into the desert, leaving behind a legacy of justice and a mystery that would haunt those who knew and loved her. Sophia Grant's disappearance left a profound void in the lives of those who knew her and in the broader fight for justice. Yet, her husband Marcus transformed his grief into action, channeling his pain into continuing the mission she had started. Determined to honor her legacy, Marcus dedicated himself to ensuring the reforms Sophia initiated became lasting and far-reaching. Under his leadership, the FBI task force expanded its efforts, rooting out corruption and abuse of power in other communities. The changes Sophia had fought for in the small desert town became a blueprint for national reform, inspiring new policies to increase transparency, accountability, and fairness within law enforcement. Training programs, oversight committees, and community outreach initiatives began to reshape policing in ways that empowered marginalized communities and restored public trust. Though Sophia's absence was deeply felt, her impact endured. Her courage in confronting injustice became a symbol of resilience and hope, sparking a movement that continued to grow. For Marcus and many others, her memory remained a driving force, a reminder that even in loss, the fight for justice must never waver. Sophia Grant's story is a powerful reminder of the deep injustices that persist and the strength it takes to confront them. Her courage and determination to seek accountability have inspired change, but the fight against racism and abuse of power is far from over. Now, we turn to you, our viewers. Reflect on the experiences shared here. Have you faced or witnessed injustice? Share your stories with us in the comments or by emailing us through the link in the description. By speaking out, you help shed light on the issues that demand change. Support the fight for justice by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with others. Together, we can amplify these voices, demand accountability, and push for the systemic changes our society so desperately needs. Let's keep this conversation alive and work toward a world where equality, fairness, and dignity prevail for everyone. Thank you for watching, and remember, Every action counts in the fight for justice.